17-year-old Zachary Davis sat in the Collin County Courthouse in McKinney, Texas, on January 22, 2014, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit and ankle restraints, his posture relaxed and his expression bordering on amused, as prosecutors presented evidence that he had brutally murdered his 47-year-old mother, Melanie Davis, with a butcher knife, stabbing her repeatedly in their family home on March 18, 2012, then calmly calling 911 to report that an intruder had broken in and killed her while he hid in terror. A lie that would quickly unravel when investigators discovered Zachary's bloody fingerprints on the murder weapon, forensic evidence contradicting his story, and his own Google searches from the night before the murder, including where to stab someone to kill them, and how long does it take to bleed out. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. For nearly 2 years between his arrest in March 2012 and his trial in January 2014, Zachary had maintained an attitude of arrogance and defiance that shocked investigators, prosecutors, and even his own defense attorneys. In jailhouse phone calls that were recorded and would later be played in court, Zachary could be heard laughing with friends about the case against him, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial, and expressing confidence that he would either be acquitted or receive a minimal sentence because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime. "They can't prove I did it," Zachary told a friend in one recorded call. "I'll be out by the time I'm 21, 22 at the most. I'll probably just get probation or some juvie time." In another call, when a friend asked if Zachary felt bad about what happened to his mother, Zachary laughed and said, "Honestly, not really. I mean, it sucks, I guess. But she was always on my case about everything. She wouldn't leave me alone." What Zachary fundamentally failed to understand, what his cavalier attitude and complete absence of remorse prevented him from grasping, was that Texas law allows prosecutors to seek adult certification for juveniles as young as 14 who commit capital murder, and that the overwhelming forensic evidence, the premeditation documented in his internet searches, his calculated lies to investigators, and his total lack of remorse would convince Judge Mark Rush to sentence him not to a few years in juvenile detention, but to life in prison with a mandatory minimum of 40 years before eligibility for parole, meaning Zachary Davis would be at least 57 years old before he could even be considered for release, and more likely would die in prison having spent his entire adult life behind bars for the murder of the woman who gave him life. When Judge Rush pronounced that sentence on January 24, 2014, after a trial that laid bare the cold-blooded nature of Zachary's crime and his shocking lack of humanity, the smirk finally disappeared from Zachary's face, replaced by a look of genuine terror and disbelief as the full weight of what he had done and what his future would be crashed down upon him in that courtroom. Zachary Adam Davis was born on September 3, 1994, in Dallas, Texas, to Melanie Davis and Christopher Davis, a couple who appeared to have built a successful middle-class life in the affluent suburbs north of Dallas. Christopher worked as a financial analyst for a major corporation, earning a substantial salary that allowed the family to live comfortably in a large home in Allen, Texas, an upscale suburb known for excellent schools and low crime rates. Melanie had been a teacher before Zachary was born, but she left her career to become a stay-at-home mother, dedicating herself entirely to raising Zachary and ensuring he had every advantage and opportunity a child could want. By all outward appearances, Zachary had an idyllic childhood. He attended top-rated public schools in the Allen Independent School District, participated in youth sports including baseball and soccer, took piano lessons, and was raised in a comfortable home where financial stress was minimal and family vacations were frequent. Melanie was an attentive, involved mother, some would later say overprotective and controlling, who monitored Zachary's schoolwork closely, drove him to activities, supervised his friendships, and set strict rules about screen time, curfews, and acceptable behavior. Christopher was more laid back in his parenting style, content to let Melanie handle most of the day-to-day parenting decisions while he focused on his demanding career. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family, problems were brewing that would eventually explode into violence. As Zachary entered his teenage years, his relationship with his mother became increasingly contentious. Melanie maintained strict rules and high expectations. She required Zachary to maintain good grades, limited his video game and computer time, insisted he complete chores before recreational activities, and closely monitored his social life, including checking his phone and computer regularly to ensure he wasn't engaging in inappropriate activities. These rules, which Melanie viewed as responsible parenting designed to keep Zachary on a good path, felt to Zachary like oppressive control that prevented him from having the freedom his friends enjoyed. Zachary began to resent his mother deeply. He complained to friends that Melanie was psycho, that she wouldn't leave him alone, that she was always criticizing him and invading his privacy. When Zachary's grades began to slip during his freshman year of high school, Melanie responded by implementing even stricter rules, taking away his phone, restricting computer access except for homework, requiring him to come straight home after school rather than hanging out with friends. These consequences, intended to motivate Zachary to improve his academic performance, instead fueled his anger and resentment toward his mother, creating a toxic dynamic where every interaction became a battle of wills. Christopher Davis, witnessing the deteriorating relationship between his wife and son, attempted to mediate but often found himself caught in the middle. He understood Melanie's concerns about Zachary's grades and behavior, but he also felt that some of her rules were overly strict and that her constant monitoring was driving Zachary away rather than helping him. Arguments between Christopher and Melanie about parenting strategies became frequent, with Christopher advocating for giving Zachary more independence and Melanie insisting that Zachary needed structure and discipline to stay on track. These parental conflicts created additional tension in the household and gave Zachary the impression that his father was on his side against his mother, an impression that would prove tragically consequential. By his junior year of high school in 2011-2012, Zachary had developed significant behavioral problems that extended beyond typical teenage rebellion. His grades had declined to the point that he was in danger of not graduating on time. He was frequently truant, skipping classes to hang out with friends, or simply staying home playing video games when his parents thought he was at school. He had begun using marijuana regularly and experimenting with alcohol, sometimes coming home high or drunk and lying to his parents about his state. Most concerning, Zachary had developed an alarming fascination with violence, spending hours watching graphic videos online, researching serial killers and infamous crimes, and playing violent video games where the primary objective was killing as many characters as possible in the most brutal ways imaginable. Melanie was aware of some of these problems. She knew about the truancy and the declining grades, but she didn't fully understand the extent of Zachary's substance use or his dark interests, because Zachary had become skilled at hiding these aspects of his life from his parents. when Melanie found evidence of marijuana in Zachary's room in February 2012, just weeks before she would be murdered. She confronted Zachary in an angry, emotional confrontation that ended with Melanie grounding Zachary indefinitely, taking away all his electronic devices, and telling him that if he didn't improve his behavior immediately, she would send him to a wilderness therapy program for troubled teens that summer, instead of allowing him to attend a music festival with friends as he had been planning. This confrontation, according to testimony that would later emerge at trial, was the catalyst that transformed Zachary's resentment toward his mother from angry thoughts into plans for murder. In the weeks following the marijuana discovery and Melanie's threats about wilderness therapy, Zachary began researching how to kill someone without getting caught. His Google search history from late February and early March 2012 included disturbing queries: how to kill someone and make it look like an accident, how to get away with murder, do teenagers go to adult prison, can minors get the death penalty in Texas, and most directly, where to stab someone to kill them quickly. These searches, later recovered by digital forensics experts from Zachary's laptop, would prove to be some of the most damning evidence against him, demonstrating clear premeditation and planning rather than an impulsive act of rage. On Sunday, March 18, 2012, Christopher Davis left early in the morning for a business trip to Houston, expecting to be gone for 3 days. This left Zachary alone in the house with Melanie, a situation that had become increasingly uncomfortable for both of them given the tension in their relationship. Melanie had plans to spend the day doing household chores, running errands, and preparing lessons for a Bible study class she taught at their church. Zachary, still grounded and restricted from electronic devices and social activities, was expected to stay home and work on homework assignments that were overdue. According to the timeline later established by investigators, the events of that day unfolded as follows. Melanie spent the morning doing laundry, cleaning the house, and working in her home office. Around noon, she prepared lunch for herself and Zachary, sandwiches and fruit that they ate in tense silence at the kitchen table. After lunch, Melanie told Zachary she was going to run errands and expected him to complete his English essay while she was gone. She left the house around 1:30 p.m., driving to Target and then to the grocery store, making purchases that were later verified through credit card receipts and store security footage. Melanie returned home at approximately 3:15 p.m., bringing groceries into the house and beginning to put them away in the kitchen. What happened next can only be reconstructed from forensic evidence and Zachary's eventual confession, because Melanie Davis would not survive to tell her side of the story. According to Zachary's confession given months after the murder, Melanie came into his room around 3:30 p.m. to check if he had completed his homework. When she discovered he had not even started the essay and had instead been lying on his bed listening to music, she became angry and began lecturing him about responsibility and consequences. Zachary, already resentful about being grounded and having his electronics taken away, responded with hostility, telling Melanie to get out of my room and to leave me alone. The argument escalated, with Melanie threatening additional punishments and Zachary becoming increasingly enraged. At some point during this confrontation, Zachary made a decision that would destroy 2 lives, his mother's and his own. He went to the kitchen, opened the knife drawer, and selected a large butcher knife with an 8-inch blade. He then returned to where Melanie was standing in the hallway outside his bedroom, and without warning or provocation beyond the verbal argument they had been having, Zachary raised the knife and plunged it into his mother's chest. Melanie, shocked and disbelieving that her own son was attacking her with a knife, instinctively raised her arms to defend herself. Zachary stabbed her again, and again, and again. The medical examiner who performed Melanie's autopsy would later testify that she had been stabbed a total of 9 times, in the chest, abdomen, arms, and back. Several of the wounds were defensive injuries where Melanie had raised her arms trying to block the knife or grab it away from Zachary. At least 3 of the stab wounds penetrated deep into her chest cavity, piercing her heart and lungs and causing massive internal bleeding. Melanie staggered backward into the hallway, leaving a trail of blood on the walls and carpet as she tried desperately to get away from her son, to reach a phone, to escape this nightmare that made no sense. But Zachary followed her, continuing to stab her even as she weakened from blood loss. Melanie collapsed in the hallway outside the master bedroom, her strength fading rapidly as her blood pooled on the carpet beneath her. According to Zachary's confession, he stood over his mother's body for several moments, watching as she took her final breaths, her eyes looking up at him with what he described as confusion and sadness, before finally going still. Zachary had just murdered his own mother, the woman who had given birth to him, raised him, loved him despite his problems and his anger toward her. And according to his own later statements to police, his immediate emotion wasn't horror or remorse or grief. It was relief that she would finally stop nagging him and controlling his life. But relief quickly turned to panic as Zachary realized the magnitude of what he had done. His mother was dead on the floor, there was blood everywhere, and he was holding the murder weapon. Zachary's first thought, according to his confession, was not to call for help or turn himself in, but to figure out how to avoid getting caught and punished for what he had done. He went to the bathroom and washed the blood off his hands, arms, and face. He changed out of his blood-soaked clothes into clean ones, stuffing the bloody clothing into a garbage bag that he planned to dispose of later. He wiped down the knife handle to remove his fingerprints, or so he thought, though he apparently missed spots where his prints would later be recovered by forensic technicians. Then, Zachary staged a scene designed to make it appear that an intruder had broken into the house and killed Melanie. He went around the house opening drawers and cabinets, scattering items on the floor to make it look like someone had been searching for valuables. He took some jewelry and cash from his parents' bedroom and hid it in his own room, planning to dispose of it later to support his story about a robbery. He jimmied the lock on the back door to make it appear someone had forced entry. And then, approximately 30 minutes after stabbing his mother to death, Zachary called 911. The 911 call, which would later be played for the jury at trial, was a masterclass in deception, or at least Zachary thought it was. On the recording, Zachary's voice sounds panicked and scared as he tells the dispatcher that someone broke into his house and attacked his mother. "I was in my room with my headphones on," Zachary says, his voice shaking with what sounds like genuine fear. "I heard my mom scream, and I opened my door, and I saw a guy in our hallway. He ran toward the back door, and I slammed my door shut and pushed my dresser in front of it because I was scared he would come after me too. I tried calling my mum, but she's not answering. Please send someone quick. I think she's hurt really bad." The dispatcher kept Zachary on the line while police and emergency medical services were dispatched to the Davis home. The dispatcher asked Zachary to describe the intruder, and Zachary provided a vague description. "He was tall, maybe wearing dark clothes. I didn't really see his face because I was so scared." When the dispatcher asked if Zachary could go check on his mother, Zachary said he was too frightened to leave his room because the intruder might still be in the house. This was consistent with someone in genuine fear, which is exactly what Zachary intended to convey. Police arrived at the Davis home at 4:18 p.m., approximately 8 minutes after Zachary's 911 call. Officers forced entry through the front door and immediately observed blood in the hallway. They followed the blood trail and found Melanie Davis's body lying face down in the hallway outside the master bedroom, surrounded by a large pool of blood that had soaked into the carpet. Paramedics who entered behind the officers checked for vital signs and determined that Melanie was deceased, having been dead for at least 20 to 30 minutes based on the condition of her body. Officers then located Zachary in his bedroom, where he said he had barricaded himself for safety. Zachary appeared shaken and scared, with tears streaming down his face, exactly as someone would expect from a teenage boy who had just witnessed his mother's murder. Detective Sarah Brennan from the Allen Police Department was the lead investigator who responded to the scene. As crime scene technicians began processing the house for evidence and photographing Melanie's body, Detective Brennan interviewed Zachary in his bedroom, taking his initial statement about what he claimed had happened. Zachary repeated the story he had told the 911 dispatcher. He had been in his room with headphones on listening to music, heard his mother scream, opened his door and saw an intruder in the hallway, then locked himself in his room for safety until police arrived. When Brennan asked if Zachary could provide any additional details about the intruder, height, weight, race, clothing, distinctive features, Zachary said he only saw the person for a second and couldn't really describe them beyond being tall and wearing dark clothes. Detective Brennan's instincts told her that something about Zachary's story didn't add up. First, there was no sign of forced entry. The back door that Zachary said the intruder had used appeared to have been tampered with recently, but the damage to the lock looked superficial and staged rather than the result of someone actually forcing their way into a locked house. Second, the pattern of blood evidence didn't support Zachary's claim that he had stayed in his room throughout the attack. There were bloody footprints that led from the hallway, where Melanie's body lay, into Zachary's bedroom, and then to the bathroom, suggesting someone had walked through the blood and then moved through those rooms after the attack. Third, nothing of significant value appeared to have been stolen despite the staged appearance of drawers being ransacked. Expensive electronics, jewelry, and cash that would be obvious targets for a burglar were all still present in the house. Most significantly, Detective Brennan noticed small spots that appeared to be blood on Zachary's hands and under his fingernails. Even though Zachary claimed he had never left his room and had never approached his mother's body. When Brennan asked Zachary about these spots, he claimed he must have gotten them when he briefly opened his bedroom door and looked out into the hallway. But this explanation didn't make sense given the distance between Zachary's bedroom door and where Melanie's body lay. Brennan made the decision to treat Zachary not just as a witness, but as a potential suspect, and she arranged for him to be taken to the police station for a more thorough interview, while crime scene investigators continued processing the house for evidence. At the Allen Police Department, Detective Brennan conducted a formal videotaped interview with Zachary. Texas law requires that parents or guardians be present when juveniles are questioned by police, but Christopher Davis was still in Houston on his business trip and wouldn't arrive home for several hours. Brennan contacted Christopher and informed him of Melanie's murder and that Zachary needed him present for questioning. Christopher immediately made arrangements to return to Allen, but it would take him approximately 4 hours to drive back from Houston. In the meantime, Zachary was held at the police station, with officers monitoring him but not conducting formal interrogation until his father could be present. During this waiting period, officers made a crucial observation. Zachary's emotional state seemed to shift when he thought he wasn't being watched. The tears and panic that he had displayed initially gave way to a calm, almost relaxed demeanor. Officers observed through a one-way mirror as Zachary sat alone in the interview room, and rather than appearing distraught as one would expect from someone who had just witnessed their mother's murder, Zachary appeared bored, occasionally checking his watch, looking around the room with curiosity rather than distress. This behavior was noted in officers' reports and would later be cited as evidence of Zachary's lack of genuine grief or trauma over his mother's death. When Christopher Davis finally arrived at the police station around 9 p.m., he was devastated and in shock over his wife's murder. Detective Brennan briefed him on what Zachary had told police about an intruder, but also informed Christopher that investigators had concerns about inconsistencies in Zachary's story and physical evidence that didn't support his account. Brennan asked Christopher if he would consent to allowing Zachary to be formally interviewed, and Christopher, believing his son was telling the truth and wanting to help catch whoever had killed Melanie, agreed. The interview, conducted with both Detective Brennan and Detective Mike Torres present and with Christopher sitting next to Zachary, began around 9:30 p.m. Brennan started by having Zachary repeat his story about what happened that afternoon, and Zachary told the same account he had given earlier. But then Brennan began asking more specific questions, pointing out the inconsistencies and problems with Zachary's version of events. Why was there no clear sign of forced entry? How could Zachary have gotten blood on his hands if he never left his room? Why did bloody footprints lead into his bedroom and bathroom? How had the intruder known to target their house in broad daylight when someone was home? Zachary's answers became increasingly vague and contradictory. He claimed he didn't know how blood got on his hands. He suggested maybe the footprints were from EMTs or police who entered his room. He said he didn't know why an intruder would target their house specifically. As the interview continued for over an hour, Christopher Davis began to realize with growing horror that his son's story wasn't holding up, that the detectives clearly suspected Zachary, and that the physical evidence appeared to contradict what Zachary was claiming. Finally, Detective Brennan confronted Zachary directly with the forensic evidence that had been collected from the scene. She told Zachary that his fingerprints had been found on the murder weapon, the butcher knife that had been recovered from the kitchen trash where Zachary had discarded it after the murder. She told him that the blood evidence showed he had walked through his mother's blood and then gone to the bathroom to clean up. She told him that his cell phone records showed no evidence of him calling or texting anyone before the murder, contradicting any suggestion that someone else might have been in contact with him. And she told him that the house's lack of forced entry and the staged appearance of the robbery suggested an inside job, not a random intruder. "Zachary," Detective Brennan said, "we know you killed your mother. The evidence proves it. What we need to understand is why. Was it an accident? Did she attack you first and you were defending yourself? Help us understand what happened so we can help you." Zachary sat silent for a long moment, his father sitting beside him with tears running down his face, realizing that his son had murdered his wife. Finally, Zachary spoke. "I want a lawyer." The interview ended immediately, as is required once a suspect invokes their right to counsel. Zachary Davis was arrested and charged with murder, held initially at a juvenile detention facility, pending a hearing to determine whether he would be tried as a juvenile or certified as an adult for prosecution. As investigators continued to build their case against Zachary, the evidence of his guilt and premeditation became overwhelming. Computer forensics experts recovered Zachary's Google search history, revealing the disturbing searches about killing someone and getting away with murder. These searches conclusively proved that Zachary hadn't killed his mother in a sudden fit of rage or in self-defense, but had planned and researched the murder for weeks before actually carrying it out. Friends who were interviewed told detectives that Zachary had complained frequently about his mother, saying she was ruining his life and that he wished she would just disappear. One friend told detectives that Zachary had joked several weeks before the murder about getting rid of his mother, though the friend hadn't taken the comment seriously at the time. Most damningly, investigators found a journal in Zachary's bedroom in which he had written extensively about his anger toward his mother and his fantasies about being free from her control. Entries from February 2012, just a month before the murder, included passages like, "I hate her so much. She won't leave me alone. Everything I do is wrong according to her. I wish she would just die so I could finally live my life the way I want." Another entry read, "Sometimes I think about what it would be like if she wasn't here anymore. Dad would be easier to deal with. He doesn't care about my grades or what I do. If it was just him and me, everything would be so much better." The Collin County District Attorney's Office filed a motion to certify Zachary Davis as an adult for prosecution, arguing that the premeditated nature of the crime, the extreme violence used, and Zachary's lack of remorse warranted adult prosecution and adult sentencing. Under Texas law, juveniles as young as 14 who commit capital murder, murder during the commission of another felony like robbery, or particularly aggravated murders can be certified as adults at the discretion of a judge. At a certification hearing in June 2012, prosecutors presented the evidence of Zachary's planning and premeditation, and Judge Mark Rush ruled that Zachary would indeed be tried as an adult in district court. Zachary's case proceeded through the criminal justice system over the next year and a half, as his defense attorneys filed various motions and both sides prepared for trial. Zachary was released on a $500,000 bond paid by his father, Christopher, with conditions that he remain under house arrest with electronic monitoring, undergo psychological evaluation and treatment, and have no contact with potential witnesses. During this pre-trial period, Zachary's behavior continued to raise concerns. The jailhouse phone calls he made, recorded as standard procedure, showed him laughing with friends, dismissing the seriousness of his situation, and expressing confidence that he would either be acquitted or receive minimal punishment. In one particularly disturbing call, a friend asked Zachary if he ever felt guilty about what happened to his mother, and Zachary replied, "Honestly, not really. I mean, I know I should feel bad, but I mostly just feel annoyed that I have to deal with all this legal stuff." Zachary's trial began on January 13, 2014, nearly 2 years after Melanie Davis's murder. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Smith, presented a devastating case that methodically proved Zachary had planned and executed his mother's murder, then attempted to cover it up by staging a burglary scene and lying to police. The evidence included Zachary's Google search history showing research about how to kill someone and get away with murder forensic evidence, including Zachary's fingerprints on the murder weapon and his bloody footprints throughout the house, the medical examiner's testimony about Melanie's 9 stab wounds and the defensive injuries showing she fought for her life, the staged appearance of the crime scene and lack of actual forced entry, Zachary's contradictory statements to police and the inconsistencies in his intruder story testimony from friends about Zachary's complaints about his mother and comments about wishing she were gone. Zachary's journal entries expressing hatred toward his mother, the recorded jailhouse phone calls showing Zachary's lack of remorse. The defense, led by court-appointed attorneys from the Public Defender's Office, faced a nearly impossible task. They couldn't credibly argue that Zachary was innocent. The evidence was far too strong. Instead, they tried to argue that Zachary had acted impulsively during an argument with his mother, rather than with premeditation, and that he suffered from mental health issues including depression and possible personality disorders that diminished his culpability. Defense psychiatrists testified that Zachary had been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and depression, and that he had difficulty regulating his emotions and controlling his impulses. They argued that while Zachary's actions were terrible, he was still a troubled teenager who deserved a sentence that acknowledged his youth and potential for rehabilitation, rather than life in prison. But prosecutors systematically dismantled the defense's arguments. The Google searches proved premeditation. Zachary had spent weeks thinking about and planning to kill his mother. This was not an impulsive act during a heated argument. The fact that Zachary staged a crime scene and lied to police showed he understood right from wrong and knew he needed to hide what he had done, contradicting any argument that he was so mentally ill he couldn't understand his actions. Most devastatingly, the jailhouse phone calls showed Zachary joking about the case and expressing no genuine remorse, undermining defense claims that he felt terrible about what he had done and was capable of rehabilitation. The most emotional testimony came from Christopher Davis, Zachary's father, who took the stand as a prosecution witness and described the loving relationship Melanie had shared with Zachary when he was younger. The deterioration of that relationship as Zachary became a teenager, and the devastating impact of losing his wife to their son's violence. Christopher testified that he had lost both his wife and his son on the day Melanie was murdered, his wife to death, and his son to the realization that Zachary was capable of such evil. "I keep asking myself how I didn't see this coming," Christopher said through tears. "How did I not realize my own son was planning to murder his mother? What could I have done differently? But the truth is, I don't think there's anything I could have done. Zachary made a choice. He chose to do this. And now I have to live the rest of my life knowing my son killed the woman I loved." The trial lasted 9 days, including testimony from dozens of witnesses, presentation of hundreds of pieces of evidence, and emotional victim impact statements from Melanie's family members describing the woman she was and the hole her death left in their lives. Throughout the trial, Zachary sat at the defense table with an expression that observers described as detached and unconcerned, occasionally whispering to his attorneys but showing no visible emotional response even when the most graphic evidence was presented. Crime scene photos of his mother's stabbed body, the bloody knife he had used to kill her, the 911 call where he lied about an intruder. On January 22, 2014, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Zachary showed no reaction, simply staring straight ahead, as if the guilty verdict didn't apply to him. Christopher Davis, sitting in the gallery, broke down sobbing, and Melanie's sister and mother clutched each other crying while telling the media afterward, "Justice for Melanie. Finally justice." The sentencing phase of the trial began immediately after the guilty verdict. Under Texas law for juveniles certified as adults and convicted of first-degree murder, the sentencing range is 5 to 99 years in prison or life imprisonment. The jury had to determine the appropriate sentence based on factors including the severity of the crime, the defendant's age and potential for rehabilitation, the need to protect society, and the impact on victims' families. Prosecutors argued for the maximum sentence, life in prison, based on the premeditated nature of the murder, the extreme violence used against Zachary's own mother, his complete lack of remorse, and the danger he posed to society if ever released. Zachary Davis planned his mother's murder for weeks, Assistant District Attorney Smith told the jury during closing arguments. He researched how to kill her. He waited until his father was out of town. He stabbed her 9 times, continuing to attack her, even as she begged for her life. Then he staged a crime scene and lied to police. And since his arrest, he has shown absolutely no remorse. He has laughed about this case. He has expressed frustration at the inconvenience of being prosecuted. He has never once expressed genuine sorrow for taking his mother's life. This is not a troubled teenager who made a tragic mistake. This is a dangerous individual who killed his own mother in cold blood and feels nothing about it. The only appropriate sentence is life in prison. The defense argued for leniency, noting that Zachary was only 17 at the time of the crime, that his brain was still developing, and that, with intensive psychological treatment over many years, he might eventually be rehabilitated and become a productive member of society. They asked the jury to consider a sentence that would give Zachary the possibility of eventual release, perhaps 40 years, which would make him eligible for parole in his late 50s after having spent the majority of his life in prison, reflecting on his actions and hopefully developing genuine remorse. On January 24, 2014, after 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their sentencing recommendation: life in prison with a mandatory minimum of 40 years before eligibility for parole consideration. Under this sentence, Zachary Davis would not be eligible to even apply for parole until 2052, when he would be approximately 57 years old, and even then, parole would not be automatic but dependent on demonstrating genuine rehabilitation and posing no further threat to society. Judge Mark Rush formally imposed the sentence, and as he read the words, life in prison with 40 years minimum before parole eligibility, the smirk that had characterized Zachary's demeanor throughout the trial finally disappeared from his face. His eyes widened in shock, his mouth dropped open, and for the first time since his arrest, Zachary appeared to comprehend that he would not be getting out of prison in 5 years, as he had told friends, would not be walking free at age 20 or 22, would not be resuming his life as if his mother's murder were merely an inconvenience he needed to endure briefly. He would be in prison for at least 40 years, and more likely would die there having never been released. "Mr. Davis," Judge Rush said, looking directly at Zachary, "you committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. You murdered your own mother, the woman who gave you life and loved you unconditionally despite your problems and your anger toward her. You planned this murder for weeks. You stabbed her 9 times, continuing to attack her even as she fought desperately for her life. You then attempted to cover up your crime by staging a burglary scene and lying to investigators. And throughout this entire process, from your arrest to your trial to this moment, you have shown absolutely no genuine remorse or empathy for the suffering you caused." Judge Rush continued, "This court has considered your age and the arguments made by your attorneys that you deserve a sentence that recognizes your youth and potential for rehabilitation. But I have also considered the overwhelming evidence of your premeditation, the brutal nature of this crime, and your complete lack of remorse. Based on all these factors, I believe the jury's sentence of life in prison with 40 years minimum is not only appropriate, but necessary to protect society and to ensure justice for Melanie Davis. You will spend the rest of your life paying for the choice you made to murder your mother. Court is adjourned." As bailiffs moved to escort Zachary from the courtroom, he turned and looked back at his father Christopher one final time. Christopher sat motionless in the gallery, his face a mask of grief and devastation. Grief for his murdered wife. Devastation that his only son would spend the rest of his life in prison. Zachary's expression as he looked at his father was difficult to read. Was it regret, fear, anger? Whatever emotions Zachary felt in that moment, it was too late for them to change anything. The damage was done, permanent and irreversible. Zachary Davis was immediately transported to a Texas Department of Criminal Justice facility to begin serving his life sentence. He was initially housed at a unit that handles younger inmates before eventually being transferred to a maximum security prison, where he would spend his adult years. As of December 2025, Zachary remains incarcerated, now 31 years old, having spent the past 13 years in prison with at least 27 more years to serve before he can even apply for parole. Melanie Davis would have been 60 years old in 2025, would have been a grandmother perhaps, would have had decades of life remaining if her son hadn't decided that his resentment over rules and discipline justified taking her life. The aftermath of Melanie Davis's murder devastated not only her immediate family, but her extended family and community as well. Christopher Davis, faced with the impossible grief of losing his wife to their son's violence, struggled with depression and guilt in the years following the trial. He gave several interviews in which he discussed the warning signs he missed, the ways he might have prevented the tragedy if he had taken Zachary's anger and resentment more seriously, the eternal question of how his son could have become a killer. Christopher eventually sold the family home in Allen. He couldn't bear to live in the place where Melanie had been murdered, and moved to another state to try to rebuild his life away from the memories and media attention. Melanie's sister Angela became an advocate for victims of domestic violence and family violence, speaking publicly about Melanie's case and the broader issue of violence within families. In interviews, Angela emphasized that Melanie had been a loving, devoted mother who had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. People sometimes ask what Melanie did to make Zachary so angry, Angela said in one interview. The answer is she parented him. She set rules. She had expectations. She loved him enough to discipline him and tried to keep him on a good path. And he murdered her for it. That should terrify every parent in America. The idea that simply being a responsible parent who sets boundaries could cost you your life at the hands of your own child. The case also sparked broader discussions about juvenile sentencing, the age at which someone can be held fully accountable for violent crimes, and whether life sentences for teenagers serve justice or simply perpetuate tragedy. Civil rights organizations and juvenile justice advocates pointed to Zachary's case as an example of overly harsh sentencing that doesn't account for adolescent brain development and capacity for change. They argued that sentencing a 17-year-old to life with 40 years minimum before parole eligibility is essentially a death sentence that denies any recognition that teenagers are different from adults and deserve to be treated differently by the justice system. But victims' rights advocates and prosecutors defended the sentence, arguing that some crimes are so heinous and some offenders so dangerous that age cannot be an excuse or shield from appropriate punishment. Zachary Davis wasn't a child who made an impulsive mistake, one victims' rights advocate said. He was a teenager who spent weeks planning to murder his mother, who researched how to kill her and get away with it, who brutally stabbed her 9 times, and who then showed absolutely no remorse. The fact that he was 17 when he did this doesn't change the fact that he's a dangerous individual who chose to commit murder and who poses a continued threat to society. Life in prison is exactly what he deserves. The psychological evaluation of Zachary Davis conducted after his conviction revealed disturbing insights into his mental state and personality. Forensic psychologists who evaluated Zachary diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a pattern of disregard for others' rights, lack of empathy, failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, and absence of remorse after harming others. The psychologist concluded that while Zachary was not legally insane at the time of the murder, he understood that killing his mother was wrong and unlawful. He lacked the normal emotional responses that prevent most people from committing such acts. His mother's death simply didn't affect him the way it would affect someone with normal empathy and emotional functioning. One particularly chilling aspect of the psychological evaluation was Zachary's response when asked if he ever thought about what his mother experienced during the attack. According to the psychologist's report, Zachary responded, "Not really. I mean, I know it probably hurt, and she was probably scared, but I don't really think about it. It's over now, so what's the point of thinking about it?" This response, the complete absence of empathy for his mother's suffering and terror as he stabbed her to death, confirmed what prosecutors and judges had concluded. Zachary Davis was a dangerous individual with no genuine remorse who would likely remain dangerous for the rest of his life. As Zachary serves his sentence, isolated from the world he destroyed through his actions, the question remains whether he will ever develop genuine remorse, whether he will ever truly comprehend the magnitude of what he did and the permanent, irreversible harm he caused. Prison records indicate that Zachary has had multiple disciplinary infractions, including fights with other inmates, possession of contraband, and insubordinate behavior toward correctional officers, suggesting that even after more than a decade behind bars, he has not developed the self-control, respect for authority, or pro-social behavior that would indicate rehabilitation. When Zachary becomes eligible for parole consideration in 2052, he will be 57 years old, having spent 40 years in prison. At that time, a parole board will evaluate whether he has been sufficiently rehabilitated to be released into society, or whether he remains too dangerous and should continue to serve his life sentence. Given his lack of remorse, his continued disciplinary problems, and the heinous nature of his crime, most legal experts believe Zachary will never be granted parole and will die in prison, exactly as Judge Rush predicted when he sentenced Zachary in 2014. The case of Zachary Davis serves as a stark reminder that evil does not have an age requirement, that even teenagers from seemingly good homes are capable of calculated, brutal violence, and that the justice system must balance recognition of adolescent development with the need to protect society from dangerous individuals. It also serves as a cautionary tale for parents about the importance of recognizing warning signs in troubled teenagers, the fascination with violence, the growing resentment and hostility, the concerning internet searches and behavioral changes that preceded Zachary's decision to murder his mother. Most importantly, the case serves as a memorial to Melanie Davis, a 47-year-old mother and teacher whose only crime was trying to parent her troubled son with discipline and structure, and whose life was brutally ended by the child she had loved unconditionally. Melanie Davis deserved to live. She deserved to see her son grow into adulthood, to become a grandmother someday, to enjoy retirement with her husband, to have decades more life to live. Instead, her life ended in terror and pain in the hallway of her own home, murdered by her 17-year-old son, who wanted to know what it would feel like to kill someone and who resented her rules and expectations enough to stab her 9 times. Zachary Davis thought he would serve 5 years and resume his life as if his mother's murder were merely an inconvenience. Instead, he heard life in prison from Judge Rush and realized too late that he had destroyed not only his mother's life but his own as well. That is justice. But it is justice that came too late to save Melanie Davis, and justice that will never truly heal the wounds her murder caused to her family, her community, and everyone who loved her. Melanie Davis is gone forever, and Zachary Davis will spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the choice he made on March 18, 2012. That is the terrible, permanent reality of murder. It destroys lives irrevocably, and no sentence, however harsh, can ever undo the damage or bring back what was lost.